Thank you very, very much, and thank you very much to the organizer of the conference for asking me to join you. I was asked to speak about, to quote it exactly, ethics and the principles of Reconstruction operations with special reference to Iraq. And I'd like to, therefore, try to frame the problem, the ethical issues that I think are raised here, by connecting the particular actions of individual Reconstruction teams, like the ones we were just hearing about, with the broader strategic objectives of the United States in Iraq and, by extension, in Afghanistan, and the ethical problems associated with those broader strategic objectives. And I think it can actually be put relatively simply. And I think it was actually visible in the very first slide that you had up. That slide, if I may be paraphrasing a little bit, but that phrase in your mission statement, your statement of purpose, specified that the goal, one of the goals, was to enhance the legitimacy and credibility of the government of Afghanistan. And that goal is obviously in the service of causing the emergence of an effective and functioning government in Afghanistan to serve the security interests of the United States. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all as an objective, and in fact, in some fundamental way, it stands behind our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in the first place, and it stands behind, and I think defensively behind, our ongoing strategic objectives in both of those countries. Not to say that we've always been successful in accomplishing those objectives, but those are the objectives that we've got. The difficulty is that reconstruction of government institutions and, broadly speaking, the functions of civil affairs units in working with local people to enhance the legitimacy of existing governments are, in some very fundamental way, at odds with the idea of creating autonomy for local governments and local actors through the mechanism of our presence as no longer de jure, but as de facto occupiers in both of these places. So I don't mean to make that more complicated than it has to be. I just mean the following. The goal is to stand up local institutions. The reality is we're trying to stand up local institutions via a process that is essentially a top-down process. And although we sometimes speak of operations as Iraqi face or Afghan face, or sometimes as Afghan-led, and we develop a set of I would call them code words for describing these things. The reality is that in each of these cases, we're talking about a decision made by the government of the United States with its coalition partners to invade other countries, subsequently to engage in what are de facto occupations of those countries, in order to transform, again, we have to be honest about this, in order to transform local institutions with the goal of convincing local people that these new institutions are actually superior to what they could have in some alternate universe or could have before. Now, again, in stating these things, I don't mean to, I'm trying to say them as neutrally as I possibly can. I think they are all potentially defensible. The point I'm trying to raise here is not to say that one has to immediately reject these objectives because they are complicated, but simply to point to a deep tension that exists within them. And again, to me, the tension is you're trying to encourage people or press people or cause people to stand up on their own, but you're doing it through the role of what I think can politely be called encouragement, but is often more honestly called coercion. And the way that I would capture this with respect to my own experience in Iraq, which was admittedly the very earliest period of the US occupation there, and in Iraq we were officially legally occupiers in the period that I was present, is that there was a consistent challenge, I would say, when one asked oneself, why did the person who just did what I asked him to do what I asked him to do? Right? Of course, one wants the person to act out of the sincere desire with the sincere goal of improving his life. Taking responsibility because it's nice to take responsibility, but also because if you take responsibility, it will be better for your family, better for your children, and better for your life. And it's very tempting to tell oneself that the reason the person has done what I've asked him is that my request actually conformed to what he independently believed would make his life go better. And then there was the problem that I was asking from the perspective of someone who was a civilian participant in a military occupation. The only reason I was in a position to ask him to do this, I of course always asked politely in the best formal Arabic that I could muster, was that my country had just conquered his country. If his country had conquered my country, he might have made the request to me, possibly not as politely, but with very, very similar objectives. He would have been interested in furthering the objectives of his own country. And again, nothing wrong with that. That's the rules of the game. But there is a deep, deep tension between these two goals. Now, why does this matter for the purposes of ethics? And I want to answer the question of why it matters for the purposes of ethics, and then I want to answer the question of why it matters for the purposes of practical real-world operations. at least try to answer both of those questions. Or to be more precise, I'll propose answers to both those questions, and you can tell me why you think I'm wrong. So first, on the question of ethics. To me, anyone who's participating as military personnel, as civilian personnel accompanying the military, even as a humanitarian aid worker under these circumstances, has already adopted what the thinker and philosopher Max Weber called the ethic of responsibility, rather than what he called the ethic of conscience. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these categories from Weber's famous essay, Politics as a Vocation, but I'll just state them very, very quickly. The ethic of conscience, according to Weber, is where one simply does the right thing without concern for its immediate consequences. That way one knows that one has acted in accordance with one's conscience. That's why it's called the ethic of conscience. One can describe one's own actions as legitimate, as pure, and as justified. And when criticized, one can say, fairly and justly, I have done what I believe to be right. By contrast, the ethic of responsibility acknowledges that what one does may well be tainted in significant ways by wrongful motives, by wrongful practices, and by harm to others. But one says, when deploying the ethic of responsibility, I am responsible, hence the name for the term, I'm responsible for the consequences of my actions, and I have to weigh my decisions against the backdrop of their real-world actual consequences. And so I accept that I may do harm, that I may do wrong, that my actions may have negative consequences, even for myself. I accept that I may compromise on core principles of morality, even for myself. And I do these things because I think the world will be, all things considered, made better off by my actions in acting in this way. Now, someone who has the ethic of conscience is, I think, quite unlikely to be willing even to engage in a process whereby we try to encourage somebody's independence and autonomy by taking away their independence and autonomy. That's an archetypal example of a violation of the ethic of conscience, because logically speaking, it makes very little sense, right? The only context in which one might say this made sense would be if one were dealing with children. I have 2 little kids myself. And so in the case of children, one regularly takes away their autonomy, they are after all children, in order to teach them to take up their own notions of autonomy. But when one is dealing with other grown human beings, the tendency to think of them in paternalistic terms, and I'm going to return to this problem of paternalism in a few moments, is a violation of the strict principle that each person ought to be in charge of his own fate. It's in violation of the strict principle of autonomy. I think we have to acknowledge that from the get-go. I'm unconcerned with acknowledging it, because that doesn't mean we're forfeiting our claim to act ethically. It just means that the ethical claims we're going to make are going to be claims made from the ethic of responsibility, where we might acknowledge that we are violating people's autonomy rights, that we are violating people's basic opportunity to stand up for themselves, in order to facilitate their being able in the future to stand up for themselves.